Tonight we're stepping into a munitions factory in wartime Britain. Not the trenches, not the general's war. This is the story of the women whose skin turned yellow so the shells could keep flying. They filled explosives by hand 12 hours at a time in rooms where a single spark meant the end of everything. And when their shift was done, they went dancing. But the yellow wasn't just on the skin, it was in the liver. And that changes this whole story. Hey, before we begin, if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that now. It just means this kind of story finds its way back to you. No searching required. The next time sleep won't come. A like helps too, and it costs nothing. Tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. A terrace house in Manchester, with the radiator ticking down. A bedroom in Texas, with the ceiling fan turning slow. Somewhere in Melbourne, maybe, with the rain just starting on the window. I read every single one. I like knowing where you all are, scattered across the nighttime half of the world. There's something about learning together in the dark, each of us in a different city but somehow in the same room. Let me know if the liver detail surprised you, or if you already knew the yellow went deeper than the skin. Now, turn the lights down low, let your shoulders drop, and let your legs go heavy. Let's step back to a factory gate in northern England, 5 in the morning, 1916. Their skin turned yellow. Not orange, not golden. Yellow, like old newspaper left in the sun. And it wasn't just the skin. The TNT they handled every day was quietly destroying their livers. Some of them died from it years after the factory gates closed for good. The yellow was the last thing anyone noticed. What did it actually feel like to arrive at a munitions factory at 5 in the morning? To hand over every hairpin at the gate before the shift could begin? How hot was the danger room? The room where one spark meant the end of everything. What happened to a woman caught carrying a single match? Why did the women who handled explosives all day spend their lunch breaks playing football? And why did 10,000 people come to watch? What did toxic jaundice actually do to a body? And why did the government try so hard to keep it quiet? When the Chilwell factory exploded and 134 people died, who walked back through those gates the next morning? And then the war ended. The country decided it didn't need them anymore. What happened to these women? The smell of tallow and chemicals in the changing room, the weight of the factory uniform folded over an arm, the cold of the concrete floor through thin-soled boots. The story starts now. Britain, 1915 through 1918. Munitions factories running day and night across the north and the Midlands, the East End of London, the industrial towns that fed the Western Front, Leeds, Birmingham, Woolwich, Chilwell, Preston, Gretna. Hundreds of sites, thousands of buildings, millions of shells. The country had built an arsenal the size of which had no precedent. The demand for ammunition was relentless. The Western Front consumed shells at a rate that industrial Britain had never imagined before the war. In 1914, British factories produced 500,000 artillery rounds per year. By 1917, they were producing 1 million per week. The mathematics of that expansion are staggering. The human cost of it, the cost borne by the women who did the actual filling, is what this story is about. The morning began in the dark. In the winter months of 1916, across northern England, the sun didn't rise until well after 8. The factory shift started at 5. That meant walking to work through streets that were still fully night. No street lamps lit the way in most factory neighbourhoods. The gas lamps had been dimmed or extinguished as a precaution against Zeppelin raids. The cobblestones were cold underfoot, slick and uneven when it rained, treacherous with ice when the temperature dropped below freezing. The air smelled of coal smoke and something sharper underneath it, a chemical edge, drifting down from the factory chimneys, faint but unmistakable. The factory itself was barely visible at that hour, just an orange glow, hanging low at the end of the road. That glow was the landmark. Every woman walking toward it knew what it meant. The cold was specific. January in Lancashire, in Yorkshire, in the Midlands. This wasn't mild damp. This was a deep settled cold that came through wool coats and stayed in the bones. The wind came off the moors and the open fields and hit the factory streets without anything to break it. The women pulled their collars up and kept their hands in their pockets, the pockets they were about to lose. Many of them wore boots that had already seen a full day's work in another life. Boots from domestic service, boots from the shop floor. The leather was cracked and the soles were wearing thin, but they held against the stone, and the sound of those boots, dozens of pairs hitting the cobblestones in uneven rhythm, carried through the empty streets like a slow drum roll. That sound, boots on stone before dawn in the dark, became one of the defining sounds of the British home front. It meant the shift was coming. The houses they passed were dark, curtains drawn, no light behind them. The neighbours who didn't work in the factories were still asleep. The factories had changed the rhythm of the neighbourhood. Before the war, the streets had been quiet until 7. Now they were active at 4:30. Boots, voices, the occasional clatter of a lunch tin. The war had reached into the domestic schedule and pulled it forward by 2 hours. The women came from everywhere. Former domestic servants who'd spent years scrubbing other people's floors on their hands and knees. Shop assistants from high street drapers who'd stood behind counters for 10 hours a day. Farm girls from villages where the war had taken every man under 40. Textile workers from Lancashire, whose mills had shifted to government contracts. Before the war, most of them had worked in houses that weren't theirs. They'd carried trays up staircases that weren't theirs, polished silver they'd never eat from, emptied chamber pots for families who rarely learned their surnames. The work had been invisible. The women had been too. Now they walked together in groups of 10 and 20. Some of them sang, not loudly, just enough to keep the rhythm going, to hold the cold at a distance. They knew each other's names now. They'd learned them on the factory floor, shouting over the noise of the machinery. These were friendships formed in a new kind of closeness. Not the closeness of a kitchen where one cook worked alone. The closeness of a factory bench, elbow to elbow, shift after shift. They walked toward the factory because the factory needed them. In 1915, the British Army had run into a crisis serious enough to make the front pages. It was running out of ammunition. Soldiers on the Western Front were being rationed to a fixed number of artillery rounds per day. Field commanders wrote urgent dispatches to the War Office, describing shell shortages at critical moments. The newspapers called it the shell crisis. It was damaging enough to bring down a government. Herbert Asquith's coalition was reshaped by the scandal, and the man who stepped into the breach was David Lloyd George. Lloyd George, newly appointed as Minister of Munitions in May 1915, created an entire ministry to solve the shortage. The Ministry of Munitions grew, within months, into one of the largest government departments in British history, employing thousands of civil servants, managing hundreds of factories, and overseeing a supply chain that stretched from raw material mines to the Western Front. The Munitions of War Act of 1915 reshaped British industry overnight. Factories were requisitioned, production quotas were set, and labour rules were rewritten. But the Act's most visible consequence, the one that changed the landscape of the country, was this. It opened the factory doors to women, not as an experiment, not as a concession, as a calculated necessity. The men who'd been making shells were now at the front carrying them. The shells still needed making, so the call went out. Recruitment posters appeared on hoardings and in shop windows. Newspaper advertisements spelled out the terms. The language was direct. Women were needed. The work was important. The wages were good. The country was asking. And the women came. Not slowly, not cautiously, in their hundreds of thousands. By 1918, munitions factories had become the single largest employer of women in Britain. The numbers were staggering. Waiting lists formed at factory gates in every industrial town, some of them weeks long. Women travelled from rural villages to cities they'd never visited. They arrived carrying a single bag, applied for a job, and started the same week. Some of them were 16, some were in their 50s. The factory didn't care. The common assumption about these women is that poverty drove them, or that patriotic pressure forced their hands, that they had no real choice. The documented record tells a different story. Factory archives show voluntary applications pouring in from across the country. Women left comparatively safe positions to be there. Domestic servants walked away from secure households. Shop assistants gave notice. Women from middle-class families, women who'd been governess material, who played piano, who spoke a little French, chose the factory floor instead. They weren't conscripted. They weren't trapped. And in large numbers, across wide geographies, they were volunteers. What drew them was partly the war itself, and the simple desire to do something that mattered. But a quieter force was also at work, and it had a number attached to it. A domestic servant in 1914, the most common previous occupation for women entering munitions work, earned between £12 and £26 a year. That was the full annual salary for a job that consumed every waking hour. A munitions worker could earn 2 to 3 times that figure. Even the lowest paid positions on the filling line paid more than senior household roles. The pay wasn't equal to what men received. Women generally earned about half the male rate for comparable work. The Munitions of War Act had included a provision promising equal pay for equal output. In practice, that promise was almost never honoured. But even the reduced rate was transformative. For many of these women, it was the first wage they'd ever earned directly, not filtered through a household budget, not given at the discretion of an employer who also controlled their meals, their free time and their bedtime, their own money in their own hands at the end of their own week. What that money could buy in 1916 was specific: rent on a room of their own, food they'd chosen themselves, a cinema ticket on Saturday evening purchased with coins they'd earned, a tube of lipstick, their lipstick chosen by them, paid for by them. The amounts were modest. The revolution apparently was affordable. The money represented something domestic service had never offered, a version of life where they existed on their own terms. That was the quiet revolution. It didn't make the newspapers. What also didn't make the newspapers was the way the money changed their posture in the world. A woman earning her own wage walked differently from a woman receiving an allowance. She made decisions. She chose where to live, what to eat, how to spend her Saturday. She opened a bank account or a post office savings book. She counted coins at the end of the week and knew, to the penny, what she'd earned. For women whose entire economic existence had been mediated by employers or husbands, the directness of that relationship, work done, money earned, money spent, was a revelation. It was also, for many of them, the first time anyone had put a number on the value of their labour, Domestic services paid for room and board and a small allowance. The factory paid a wage. The difference was not just financial, it was conceptual. A wage said that the work had value. A wage said that the woman doing it had value. And once that had been said, it was difficult to unsay. The women who came to work in the factories brought their domestic skills with them, whether they intended to or not. They were used to precision, the precision of keeping a house running on a tight budget. They were used to long hours. Domestic servants often work from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. They were used to doing what they were told without complaint. These were not the qualities that the recruitment advertisements emphasized, but they were the qualities that made the women effective on the factory floor. The discipline of domestic service, which had been invisible and undervalued, turned out to be transferable to munitions production. The women who'd polished silver and starched shirts were, it transpired, extremely good at filling shells. The factory gate was the first thing a new worker saw up close. Iron-framed, industrial, wide enough for delivery lorries and heavy transport. Behind it, the factory rose, high brick walls darkened with years of soot, iron pillars supporting a roof that disappeared into shadow. The building was enormous. Some of these factories stretched over acres. A woman seeing it for the first time could stand at one end of the filling hall and barely make out the far wall through the haze. And the noise, even from outside, was a physical thing, a deep, constant industrial vibration that wasn't just heard, it was felt. It pressed against the chest and settled in the teeth, not sharp, thick. It filled the ears before anyone had even explained what was making it. Women who'd come from quiet kitchens, quiet shops, quiet farms. The sound alone was enough to stop them at the gate, but only for a moment. Then they stepped through. Inside the gate, the factory opened up. The scale of it was difficult to take in at once. The main filling halls were as large as any building most of these women had ever entered. Long, wide, high-ceilinged spaces built to accommodate heavy machinery and large-scale production. The floor was concrete, swept clean, marked with painted lines that divided the hall into work zones. The benches ran in long rows, dozens of them, stretching from one end of the hall to the other. Above, iron girders held the roof in place. Gas lamps and later electric bulbs hung from brackets at intervals, throwing a flat, even light that removed most shadows. The air inside was different from the air outside. It had a weight to it, a specific chemical density that sat on the tongue and coated the inside of the nose. The dominant smell was TNT itself, a sharp, slightly sweet, faintly acrid odour that new workers noticed immediately and that long-term workers eventually stopped registering. Underneath it, other smells: machine oil from the shell casings, tallow from the greasing stations, the flat mineral scent of concrete and iron, and something else, something harder to name. A warmth that had bodies in it, hundreds of women working in a single space, hours at a time, in a building that didn't ventilate well enough. The first women to arrive for the early shift found the factory at its quietest. The night shift was still wrapping up. The handover happened in the corridors, in the changing rooms, in the brief overlapping minutes when both shifts occupied the same building. A woman finishing a 12-hour night shift looked different from a woman arriving for the day shift. The tiredness was visible, in the posture, in the way the face settled, in the slightly unfocused quality of the eyes. The night shift workers carried the yellow more obviously. 12 hours under artificial light seemed to deepen the colour on the skin. The day shift arrivals, their own skin still its natural shade, or what was left of its natural shade after weeks of exposure, could see the future in the faces of the women leaving. The factory was never still. Even during the handover, even in the brief minutes between shifts, something was running. Machinery hummed. Ventilation fans turned. The lights stayed on. The building operated as a continuous system. 3 shifts, 24 hours, 7 days a week. Sunday was not a day off. Christmas was debatable. The war didn't pause, and the production schedule didn't pause with it. For a woman arriving on her first day, the overwhelming impression was one of organised enormity. Every surface, every walkway, every bench position had a purpose. Every woman had an assigned station. Every process had a sequence, and every sequence had a supervisor who enforced it. The discipline was military in its structure, even if the workers were civilian. Timekeeping was precise. Movement between zones was controlled. Access to restricted areas required clearance. The women learned quickly that the factory ran on rules, and that the rules were not suggestions. The gate, though, was not where the work began. The work began in the changing room, and the changing room was where the strangeness started. The changing room was a long, narrow space with wooden benches running down the centre and metal lockers lining the walls. The air was damp and warm, the accumulated humidity of hundreds of women changing in the same enclosed space, shift after shift. The smell was a mixture of carbolic soap, damp wool, and the faint, persistent chemical residue that had soaked into every surface. The floor was wet. It was always wet. Boots tracked in water from the walk, and the cleaning couldn't keep up with the traffic. The conversations in the changing room were the day's first social contact. Women talked as they undressed, about their families, about the weekend, about what they'd seen on the walk-in. The talk was quick and practical. It had to be. The changing time was limited, and there was a queue behind every locker. But inside that practical exchange was something warmer. These were women who'd worked together for months, sometimes years. They knew each other's children's names. They knew who was worried about a husband at the front. They knew whose mother was ill, whose rent was overdue, whose sister was getting married. The changing room was the factory's social nerve centre, the place where information moved, where moods were registered, where the community maintained itself. Every woman, every shift, every day went through the same procedure. It was not optional, and it was not quick. Step 1. Remove all civilian clothing, everything, coat, dress, blouse, petticoat. All of it came off and went into a locker. Step 2. Remove all jewellery, rings, earrings, brooches, necklaces. Every piece was collected, tagged, and placed in a separate tray. And then step 3, the one that stops people. Remove all hairpins, every single one. They were counted, not estimated, counted. Logged in a register beside the woman's name. Placed in a numbered tray. The hair fell loose. A factory cap went on instead. The procedure happened every single morning, with every single worker, and it was never skipped. The reason was simple, and it was lethal. A metal hairpin, falling from a woman's hair onto a workbench dusted with TNT powder, could generate a static spark on contact. A single spark, in a room packed with trinitrotoluene, didn't cause a fire. It caused a detonation. The kind that flattened a building in under a second. The kind that killed every person inside before anyone understood what had happened. So the pins came out. One by one, each morning, pulled from the hair and handed to an inspector who watched and counted. The same small ritual of surrender, repeated by thousands of women at 5 o'clock every working day for years. The uniform went on next. It was made from a fabric specifically chosen to eliminate static electricity. Nothing the women would have recognized from their own wardrobes. Silk was banned from the factory floor entirely, absolutely without exception. Silk generated static charge. In a room filled with explosive powder, static occupied the same operational category as a lit match. The fabric that every domestic servant had once aspired to wear on her half-day off was now, inside this building, indistinguishable from a loaded weapon. Somewhere in the history of fashion, silk had gone from luxury to threat without anyone updating the brochure. The uniform had no pockets. This wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate design decision. A pocket was a place where something small could be forgotten. A button, a coin, a matchbox. And a matchbox in a munitions factory was the most dangerous civilian object in wartime Britain. The humble matchbox, sold in every corner shop for a penny, had been promoted inside these walls to the same threat level as a German artillery battery. A woman caught carrying a match onto the factory floor faced immediate dismissal. Not a warning, not a reprimand. Dismissal, on the spot that morning. In some documented cases, criminal prosecution followed. The logic was unforgiving but perfectly clear. One match head, one moment of accidental friction, one room full of explosive powder. The factory ceases to exist. The final step before entering the danger zones was the inspection. Each woman stood still while a senior worker, usually another woman, usually someone who'd been doing this for months, checked her hands, her hair, her uniform line by line. No metal left anywhere, no forbidden fabric, no matchstick wedged into a fold or a seam, no loose thread that might catch on machinery. Only when the inspection was complete could she step through. There's a particular quality to that image. Thousands of women standing in line before dawn, having their hairpins counted by other women, wearing uniforms with no pockets. In buildings where a match was treated as a criminal weapon. It sounds almost theatrical, like bureaucracy performing caution for its own satisfaction. But everyone inside those walls knew what the rules prevented. They knew because the rooms on the other side of that door contained enough explosive material to level a town, and because, 18 months into the war, they'd already heard what happened when the rules weren't enough. There is a number attached to what that failure looked like. It happened at Chilwell, in Nottinghamshire, on a summer afternoon. We'll come back to it later tonight. What came first, past the changing room door and through the inspection point, was the floor. The factory floor itself, the danger room. And the first time a new worker stepped through that door, the first thing she registered was heat. The filling stations ran hot, not the kind of heat that came from a stove or a fire, but a dense chemical warmth that hung in the air and didn't move. It sat on the skin. It thickened in the throat. The ventilation systems in early munitions factories were basic at best. A few fans mounted high on the walls, pulling air that didn't want to go anywhere. The temperature at the filling benches, particularly in summer, could climb until the workers' uniforms were dark with sweat by the third hour. The room itself was enormous. Long rows of wooden benches stretched the length of the hall, lit by artificial light that turned everything a flat, shadowless yellow. Above, the ceiling disappeared into ironwork and pipe runs. Below, a concrete floor that had been swept clean of every particle, or was supposed to have been, because what the women worked with was trinitrotoluene, TNT. Understanding what TNT actually is matters for the rest of this story. Trinitrotoluene is a crystalline yellow solid, not a liquid, not a gas. A solid with a texture somewhere between coarse sugar and chalk dust. In its solid block form, it's surprisingly stable. It can be dropped, heated moderately, even set on fire, and it will burn without exploding. It requires a detonator, a sharp, precise shock, to trigger a full detonation. That stability is what made it useful, and it's also what made it deceptive. Because in powder form, in large quantities, in an enclosed space, with the right kind of spark at the right moment, TNT was catastrophic. The same substance that could survive being dropped from a bench could, as a fine dust cloud, detonate from a static discharge. TNT was, in other words, the kind of colleague who seemed perfectly reasonable until one small thing went wrong. The women who worked with it were, in a sense, working inside a paradox. The material was safe until it wasn't, and the distance between those two states was measured in particles. The shell-filling process itself was methodical, physical, and repetitive. It went like this. Empty shell casings arrived at one end of the hall. They came from steel foundries across the country, heavy, cold, smelling of machine oil and iron. Each casing was a cylinder of forged steel, open at one end, waiting to be filled. The casings came in different sizes. Some were small enough for a woman to lift with one hand. Others required two hands and a strong back. The TNT arrived separately. In the early stages of the war, it came as solid blocks that had to be melted and poured. By mid-war, much of the filling was done with TNT in its powdered or granular form. The specific look of it was distinctive, a bright chemical yellow, the same yellow that would eventually stain the women who handled it. It was scooped, measured, and poured into the casings by hand. Not by machine, by hand. A woman at a filling station repeated the same sequence hundreds of times per shift. Scoop the powder, pour it into the casing, tamp it down with a tool designed to apply exactly the right pressure, not too hard, not too soft. Weigh the filled shell on a balance. If it was light, add more. If it was heavy, scrape some out. Move the completed shell to the next station. Reach for the next empty casing. Begin again. 12 hours of this. Sometimes 13. The tamping was physically demanding in a way that accumulated rather than struck. It wasn't one heavy lift. It was the same moderate effort, repeated without interruption, for the length of an entire shift. By the 4th hour, the muscles of the forearms burned. By the 8th, the shoulders had settled into a deep, constant ache that didn't respond to stretching. By the 10th, the women's hands moved from memory. The body worked while the mind went somewhere else. But the most dangerous single action on the filling floor was not the scooping, not the pouring, and not the tamping. It was the detonator. The detonator was a small device, inserted into the completed shell to provide the shock that would trigger the TNT on impact. It was tapped into place by hand, using a tool designed to deliver the absolute minimum possible force. Too little force, and the detonator wouldn't seat properly. Too much force, and the detonator would fire, in the woman's hands, at the bench, surrounded by other shells. Every tap had to be exactly right, not approximately right, exactly. The margin for error was effectively zero, and this precision was required not once, but continuously. Tap after tap, shell after shell, hour after hour, for the full duration of a 12-hour shift. The mental discipline required was extraordinary. The women couldn't let their attention drift, couldn't let fatigue soften their hands, couldn't let the rhythm of repetition make them careless. One tap too hard, and the detonator fired. There were no second chances with that mistake. The filling floor was not the only area of the factory. Most munitions works contained multiple production zones, each with its own specific danger. There were the melting rooms, where solid TNT was heated to a liquid state for pouring into certain types of shell. The temperature in those rooms was extreme. The women who worked there stood over vats of heated explosive, stirring with long-handled tools in air that shimmered with chemical vapor. There were the inspection rooms, where completed shells were examined for defects. Cracks in the casing, uneven filling, improperly seated detonators. There were the packing rooms where finished shells were loaded into crates for transport to the railway stations that would carry them to the ports. Each zone had its own risks, its own routines, its own specific version of the 12-hour day. The women who worked the melting rooms came out drenched in sweat, their uniforms dark with it, their faces flushed even in winter. The women in inspection handled shells that had already been filled, complete, fused, live. One crack in a casing, one misaligned detonator, and the shell they were holding was a weapon that had failed its containment. The packing room workers lifted shells by hand, each one weighing several pounds, hundreds of times per shift. Their arms and shoulders developed a kind of lean, wiry strength that surprised people who saw them outside the factory. The welfare supervisors were a later addition to the factory system. They were usually women, educated, middle class, appointed by the government or by the factory management to monitor the health and well-being of the workers. Their job was to watch for the early signs of TNT poisoning, the yellow tinge appearing on the hands, the first complaints of headaches or nausea, the visible fatigue that went beyond ordinary tiredness. In theory, the welfare supervisors could recommend that a woman be moved to a less dangerous area, or given time off, or sent for medical examination. In practice, the recommendations were often overruled by production demands. The shells were needed. The women were needed. The welfare supervisor's report was noted, filed, and frequently ignored. The breaks between work periods were short and regimented. 15 minutes mid-morning, 30 minutes for lunch, 15 minutes mid-afternoon. The women were not permitted to sit at their benches during breaks. The benches were in the danger zone, and food was not allowed near the TNT. They had to leave the filling hall, walk to the canteen or the break area, eat, and return. The walking itself consumed some of the break time. A woman at a station near the far end of a long filling hall could lose 5 minutes just reaching the door. What the women thought about during those repetitive hours is not widely documented. The factory floor was too loud for sustained conversation. The noise of machinery, ventilation fans, the clatter of steel casings being moved along the line. It pressed against the ears and flattened everything into a constant industrial hum. Some accounts describe women developing their own communication systems, lip reading across benches, hand signals, a kind of proximity language born from the impossibility of speaking. There was a particular gesture described in several accounts that involved one woman catching another's eye and making a small motion with the head, a tilt, a nod, that could mean half a dozen things depending on context. Are you all right? Do you need a break? Watch the supervisor, something is wrong. The gesture vocabulary was never codified. It didn't need to be. The women who worked together long enough understood each other's movements the way musicians understand a conductor. The language was physical, wordless, and precise. What went on inside their heads, behind their eyes, during the long middle hours of a shift, that remained private. Some women said later that they thought about their children. Some thought about money, what they'd spend the week's wages on, whether they could afford a new pair of stockings, Some thought about nothing at all, which is its own kind of mental state, the emptiness that arrives when the hands are too busy for the mind to be needed. The yellow came gradually. It didn't happen on the first day or even the first week. TNT is absorbed through the skin. Handling it with bare hands, which was standard practice for much of the war, meant the chemical entered the body slowly, steadily, with every shift. The first sign was usually the hands, a faint discoloration, barely noticeable, then the wrists, then the forearms. Over weeks and months the yellow spread. It reached the face, the neck, the hairline. The colour wasn't subtle. It was a distinct, visible, chemical yellow. The colour of the powder itself, as though the substance had simply migrated from the bench into the body. The women's hair changed too. Blonde hair turned orange. Dark hair took on a strange coppery sheen. Even their nails yellowed. The other workers noticed. The public noticed. The women who'd turned yellow were recognised in the street, on the bus, in the shops after their shift. People started calling them Canary Girls. The name stuck. It was affectionate in a way. It was also the name for a condition that was killing them. The social experience of being visibly yellow was specific and complicated. On the one hand, it was a mark of service. Everyone in a factory town knew what the yellow meant. It meant this woman handles explosives. It meant she's doing dangerous work. It meant she's contributing to the war effort in a way that most civilians were not. There was a respect attached to it, the same respect in some communities that a uniform carried. The yellow was an unofficial uniform. On the other hand, it attracted unwanted attention. Stares on the omnibus, whispered conversations in the greengrocer's queue, the specific pointed curiosity of people who had never been inside a munitions factory and found the physical evidence of it unsettling. Some of the women felt self-conscious about it. They wore gloves in public. They kept their hands in their pockets. They avoided well-lit social situations where the yellow would be most visible. But many of them didn't hide it. Many wore the yellow openly, almost proudly. The Canary Girls nickname was adopted by the women themselves, not just by outside observers. Some factory football teams were called the Canaries. Some women used the name in their own conversations. I'm a Canary Girl working at such and such. The name carried an identity, and identity was something these women had not had much of before the factory. The dancing was part of the culture. After shifts on Saturday nights, in the working men's clubs and dance halls of factory towns, the munitions women went dancing. They went with their yellow skin, their factory-earned wages, and their specific, hard-won energy. The dances were lively. The music was loud. The women danced with soldiers home on leave, with other factory workers, with each other. The yellow hands holding a partner's shoulders, the yellow face catching the light of the dance hall. These were images that people who saw them remembered. The contrast was too vivid to forget. Women who handled death all day, who worked with substances that could kill them, who knew the risks and took them anyway. Those same women on a Saturday night, dancing. The laughter in those dance halls was not denial. It was not escapism. It was the specific, fierce joy of being alive after a week when being alive had not been guaranteed. The women understood this, even if they didn't articulate it in those terms. The dancing was an answer to the danger, not a forgetting of it, an answer to it. Some of the women who went dancing on Saturday were back at the bench on Monday, with bruises from the dance floor and aches from the factory floor. The two kinds of physical exertion, the regimented precision of the filling bench, the chaotic freedom of the dance hall, existed side by side. The body that tapped detonators with absolute care on Monday was the same body that had been spinning and laughing and stamping on Saturday night. The contrast wasn't contradiction, it was range. It was the full width of what a human being could contain. Because the yellow was not just staining, it was not just cosmetic, it was the visible surface of something happening inside the body, and what was happening inside was far worse. Toxic jaundice. That was the medical term. TNT, absorbed through the skin and inhaled as fine dust over months of exposure, accumulated in the liver. The liver attempted to process it, and failed. The organ began to fail. The progression was gradual and cruel. Nausea arrived first, a persistent low-level sickness that didn't respond to fresh air or food. The women who experienced it often attributed it to bad food or tiredness, at least initially. Then the headaches came. Not ordinary headaches, deep-pressured headaches that sat behind the eyes and didn't respond to aspirin. The headaches were the body's distress signal. The liver, overwhelmed by the chemical burden, was failing to filter toxins from the blood. The poisons that the liver should have been removing were circulating freely, and the brain was registering the damage. Skin rashes appeared next, raised, red, itching patches that spread across the arms and hands. The rashes were often misdiagnosed as eczema or dermatitis, but they weren't ordinary skin conditions. They were the skin's reaction to a chemical that had penetrated far deeper than the surface. Then the eyes turned yellow, not from the powder this time, but from bile that the damaged liver could no longer process. This was the diagnostic marker. When a woman's eyes turned yellow, the welfare supervisor knew what it meant. It meant the liver was failing. It meant the woman needed to be removed from the filling floor immediately. In some cases, that recommendation was followed. In others, it was not. The shells were needed. The woman was needed. Extreme weakness followed. Women who'd been strong enough to fill shells for 12 hours couldn't walk up a flight of stairs. The muscles lost their tone. The appetite vanished. The body, which had been running on adrenaline and discipline and necessity, simply stopped. And then, in documented cases, death. Not sudden, not dramatic. A quiet, exhausted surrendering of organs that had been poisoned beyond their capacity to recover. The death toll from toxic jaundice among munitions workers during the war is difficult to pin to a single number. The condition often developed slowly, and many women died months or years after leaving the factory. Their deaths were recorded as liver failure, not as industrial casualties. But the connection was known. It was known early, and the document that proved it was already sitting on a government desk. In 1917, a report was published, the Report on Industrial Poisoning Among Female Workers in Munitions Factories. It documented the health risks of TNT exposure in detail. It described the symptoms, it identified the cause, it recommended ventilation improvements, protective equipment, and reduced shift lengths. Parts of those recommendations were implemented. Ventilation fans were added to some factories. Medical inspections became more frequent. Milk was distributed on some filling floors in the belief that it might slow TNT absorption. But the report was not widely publicized. The details of what TNT did to the women who handled it were not released to the general public. The reasons were wartime reasons: morale, production, the fear that women would stop volunteering if they understood the full risk. The factories needed workers, the front needed shells, and the shells needed filling. I want to be careful here, because it's tempting to tell this part of the story as a simple betrayal. Government knew, government hid, women suffered. The truth has more weight than that. The women themselves were not ignorant. Many of them could see the yellow on their own hands. They watched colleagues fall ill. They heard the rumours about what the chemicals did, and they came back, shift after shift, morning after morning, not because they didn't know, but because the alternative, going home, losing the wage, losing the independence, sitting in a house where the man was at the front and the rent was still due, was its own kind of impossible. What the danger room looked like at midnight was different from the morning. The artificial light seemed flatter. The yellow powder on the benches caught it and held it, giving everything a faint, eerie glow. The ventilation fans hummed at the same pitch they'd been humming all day. The sound never changed. The rhythm of the tapping continued, that precise, careful, life or death percussion that had been going since the morning shift began. But the women moved slower now. The fatigue was visible in the way they reached for the next casing, in the way they stood, weight shifted to one hip, then the other, managing the ache in joints that had been locked in the same position for hours. The night shift had its own character. The women who worked it arrived in the early evening, when the streets were still busy and the daylight was only beginning to fade. They walked against the flow of ordinary life, past people heading home, past children being called in for supper, past shops closing their shutters. By midnight, the factory was an island. The world outside had gone dark and quiet. Inside, the light and noise continued without interruption. The filling hall at 2 a.m. felt like a place outside of time. The same actions, the same sounds, the same chemical air repeated in an endless present tense. The night workers often said the hardest hour was the one before dawn. The body, which had evolved to sleep in darkness, resisted the artificial light and the continued demands of the work. The eyes grew heavy. The hands wanted to slow. The specific danger of the detonator tap was at its highest in those pre-dawn hours, when the concentration required was at war with every biological impulse the body possessed. The women who survived the night shift intact, shift after shift, week after week, did so through a combination of discipline, habit, and the specific stubbornness that working-class women of this era had been trained into from childhood. The smell of the room deepened over the course of a shift. In the morning it was chemical, sharp, industrial, recognizable as TNT and machine oil. By the 8th hour it had layered, human sweat underneath the chemical edge, the warm, heavy air that came from too many bodies in a room that didn't circulate well enough, a faintly metallic taste at the back of the throat. The women who'd been there longest didn't notice it anymore. The new ones always did. Somewhere, past the filling hall and through a set of doors that the women were not supposed to think about too carefully, was the storage area. Completed shells, stacked and waiting for transport. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Each one filled by a woman standing at a bench, one scoop at a time, one tap at a time, in a room where the rules existed because the alternative was an explosion that nobody in the surrounding streets would survive. That explosion was not hypothetical. It had already happened. In Silvertown, in the East End of London, on a cold January night in 1917, it happened. And the women in every other factory in the country heard about it before the newspapers printed a word. Silvertown was a neighbourhood in the East End of London, working class, densely packed, built tight around the industrial works that gave it a living. The terraced houses ran close to the factories. The pub stood on the same streets as the workshops. Children played in roads where factory lorries turned corners twice a day. It was the kind of place where the boundary between home and industry wasn't a line. It was a smudge. The neighbourhood had its own rhythms, its own routines, its own specific texture. Market day brought crowds to the local streets. Washing was hung in backyards that looked out onto factory walls. The air always smelled faintly of industry, chemicals, machine oil, coal smoke from the works. The children of Silvertown grew up with factory noise as their background sound. the way children in the countryside grew up with birdsong. It was ordinary to them. It was home. The women of Silvertown who worked in the local factories often walked to work in under 10 minutes. Some could see their front door from the factory gate. The closeness was convenient. It was also, as it turned out, deadly. The Brunner-Mond factory sat at the heart of it. Not a shell-filling plant, but a TNT refinery. A facility where raw trinitrotoluene was purified and processed for distribution to the filling factories across the country. The work was different from what the women at Chilwell or Preston were doing. This was the upstream process: heating, melting, refining, turning crude TNT into the powdered form that the filling workers would eventually scoop into shells. The factory employed men and women both. Many of the workers were local. They lived in the streets that surrounded the site, walked to work in under 10 minutes, went home for lunch when the shift allowed. Their houses backed onto the factory walls. Their children slept within a few hundred yards of 50 tons of stored trinitrotoluene. That number is not an estimate. 50 tons. It matters. On the evening of the 19th of January 1917, a fire broke out in the meltpot room. The meltpot room was where solid TNT was heated to its liquid state. The exact cause of the ignition was never conclusively determined. What is known is that a fire started, that it spread, and that the factory's fire crew responded. What happened next was a decision, the kind that gets made in 60 seconds and then can never be unmade. The fire crew attempted to contain the blaze. Whether they had any realistic chance of success is a question that historians have debated since. What they didn't know, or perhaps did know and tried to prevent anyway, was that the fire was moving toward the stored TNT. At 6:52 in the evening, 50 tons of trinitrotoluene detonated. The blast was felt across most of London, not heard from a distance, felt. The concussion wave travelled outward from Silvertown at a speed that turned solid buildings into moving objects. Windows shattered for miles. Roofs lifted from their joists. Walls cracked, buckled, fell. In the immediate vicinity of the factory, the destruction was absolute. The building ceased to exist. The houses closest to it ceased to exist with it. 73 people died. Dozens more were seriously injured. Between 60,000 and 70,000 properties were damaged, a number so large that it's difficult to picture. Imagine a circle drawn around the factory expanding outward, and everything inside that circle. Every house, every shop, every school, every pub, shaking, cracking, breaking, glass everywhere. Dust filling the air for hours, the orange glow of fires burning in half a dozen streets at once. Among the known dead were workers, local residents, and members of the fire crew who had responded to the initial fire. These men had arrived at the factory knowing it contained explosives. They had entered the building with the intention of containing the blaze before it reached the main stockpile. They understood what they were walking toward. The decision to enter was not a bureaucratic order. It was a choice made in seconds by men who could see the fire and could calculate roughly what was behind it. A firefighter named Frederick Sell died alongside his 15-year-old daughter, Winifred. They were both in the area when the blast struck. That specific detail, a father and daughter, a teenager, and the man who was supposed to protect her, both lost in the same second, is the kind that tends to escape the broader statistics. The numbers tell the scale. The names tell the cost. The people who survived in the surrounding streets carried the experience in their bodies for years. The concussion wave had physical effects that persisted long after the buildings were repaired. Some residents reported hearing loss that never fully recovered. Others described persistent ringing in the ears. a phantom vibration that echoed the blast months after it had happened. Children who had been in their beds when the windows blew in had nightmares that continued for years. The psychological damage was real, documented and largely untreated. The government's response to Silvertown was swift, calculated, and largely hidden. The explosion appeared in the newspapers, but the reports were incomplete. The official line described an industrial accident, which it was. What the reports did not explain was the scale of the TNT stockpile, the government contract that had placed a refinery in a residential neighborhood, or the specific reason why the fire proved impossible to control. Information was classified. The phrasing was deliberate. The goal was to prevent public panic, and also to prevent the enemy from understanding the exact nature and location of British munitions infrastructure. There was another motive, quieter and more uncomfortable. If the Silvertown explosion were understood as a domestic accident, not a German attack, not sabotage, but a fire in a British factory processing British explosives, it raised questions that the government did not want to answer in wartime. Questions about the placement of munitions works in populated areas. Questions about the adequacy of safety protocols. Questions about the lives of workers and residents who lived in the shadow of facilities they barely understood. Those questions were not publicly asked. Not in 1917. Not during the war. The inquiries came later when the urgency had passed, and by then Silvertown had been rebuilt and the dead had been quietly buried. The immediate aftermath of the explosion was chaos on a scale the neighborhood had never experienced. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Fires burned in multiple locations simultaneously. The force of the blast had ruptured gas mains, and the resulting fires were fueled by the very infrastructure designed to keep the neighborhood running. Firefighters who arrived at the scene found that many of the buildings they were trying to save no longer had roofs. Some no longer had walls. The rescue operation continued through the night and into the following day. Local residents who had survived the blast emerged from damaged houses in a state of shock. Some were covered in plaster dust and broken glass. Some were bleeding from injuries they hadn't yet noticed. Children were carried into the street by neighbours. Elderly residents who couldn't move quickly had been trapped in rooms where the ceiling had partially collapsed. The hospitals in the surrounding area, already stretched by wartime demands, were suddenly flooded with civilian casualties. The damage extended far beyond the immediate blast zone. Houses a mile from the factory had their windows blown in. The glass travelled inward at high speed, an invisible danger that arrived without warning. Families sitting in their front rooms, eating dinner, reading newspapers, were struck by fragments of their own windows. The injuries from flying glass were among the most common reported in the days after the explosion. In the streets closest to the factory, the destruction was total. Entire rows of terraced houses were reduced to rubble. Families lost everything: clothing, furniture, photographs, keepsakes, the small objects that made a house a home. The displacement was immediate and complete. Hundreds of families had nowhere to sleep that night. Temporary shelters were set up in schools and church halls. The women from those streets who had worked in the factory and survived found themselves homeless and unemployed in the same moment. In the weeks after the explosion, the women at other factories, as in Preston, in Leeds, in Chilwell, in Birmingham, heard the news. Not from the newspapers, which had printed the minimum, from each other. From the rumour networks that ran through factory towns faster than any official channel. Word moved from shift to shift, bench to bench, changing room to changing room. Silvertown blew up. 50 tons, 73 dead, houses gone. They said it quickly, in the changing room before the inspector came. They said it with their hands, at the bench, where speaking was impossible. The information moved through the factories like a pulse. The women at other factories also heard the details that the newspapers didn't print. How close the houses were to the factory, how the glass had travelled, how the children had been carried out. These details, specific, human, impossible to abstract, were the ones that landed hardest, because the women hearing them lived in houses just as close to their own factories. Their own children played in streets just as near to the gates. What is remarkable, and what no amount of historical distance can flatten into routine, is what happened next. The women at those other factories went to work the following morning. They walked the same dark streets. They handed over their hairpins at the gate. They put on their pocketless uniforms. They stepped through the inspection point onto the factory floor into rooms filled with the same substance that had just destroyed a neighbourhood in East London. Not all of them. Some women did leave munitions work after Silvertown, but the majority clocked in, picked up their tools and resumed filling shells. The reasons were as complex and specific as the women themselves. Some felt the work was necessary. Some couldn't afford to leave. Some had built friendships on the factory floor that they didn't want to lose. Some simply didn't believe it would happen to them, which is a human calculation as old as danger itself. There is something in that image that stays, not the bravery. The word bravery is too clean for what this was, not the stoicism which suggests they didn't feel the fear. They felt it. What stays is the picture of a woman walking through the factory gate the morning after Silvertown, knowing exactly what was on the other side of the door and stepping through it anyway. Not because she was brave, because she had decided that what waited on the other side was still better than what waited at home. The memorial for Silvertown, when it eventually came, was local, community-led, modestly funded, quietly attended. The language on the memorial stone spoke of accident and loss, not service, not sacrifice. Accident. The distinction mattered to the families, and it mattered to the women who continued working. An accident could happen to anyone. Service was something the country honoured. Accident was something the country regretted and moved past. The safety improvements that followed Silvertown were real but limited. Some factories upgraded ventilation. Some added blast walls between storage areas and filling rooms. Medical inspections were increased, and welfare supervisors, usually women, were appointed to monitor the health of the workers. These were genuine changes. They reduced some of the daily risk. But the fundamental nature of the work did not change. Women still stood at benches, filling shells with TNT by hand, tapping detonators into place one at a time, in rooms where the same substance that had levelled Silvertown was present in quantities that could level their factory too. The rules were tightened, the inspections were sharpened, the hairpins were still counted, and 18 months later, on a warm afternoon in July 1918, the thing that Silvertown had warned about happened again. This time in Nottinghamshire. This time at Chilwell. This time 134 people died. But before that afternoon, before the explosion that no memorial would mark for nearly a century, something else happened in the factories. Something unexpected. Something that had nothing to do with shells, or TNT, or the war effort, or the government's careful silence. The women started playing football. It started the way most things start in factories, without permission, without planning, during the 30 minutes when nobody was watching. The lunch break in a munitions factory was short. 30 minutes, sometimes 45. It was the only period in the entire shift when the women weren't standing at a bench with explosive powder in front of them. Some factories had canteens, long bare rooms with wooden tables and tea urns. Others had nothing. The women ate wherever they could find a flat surface and enough space to sit. The food was what they'd brought from home. Bread, margarine, a piece of cheese if they had it. By 1917, wartime rationing made even that modest meal a calculation. How much bread was left? Whether the margarine would last the week. But the food wasn't the point of the break. The point was the space. For 30 minutes, the factory floor was behind them. The noise dropped. The heat lifted. The air outside, even if it was cold and damp and smelled of soot, was not chemical. It was air that didn't taste of TNT. And in that space, in factory yards across the country, women started kicking a ball around. Nobody planned it. Nobody organised it. The ball was whatever was available, sometimes a real football, more often a bundle of rags or a tin can. The ground was whatever lay behind the factory walls, mud, gravel, uneven paving, grass if they were lucky. The women played in their factory boots, which were heavy, flat-soled and designed for standing at a bench, not for running. They played in their factory uniforms, which were loose, pocketless, and not designed for anything resembling sport. Nobody had consulted the uniform designers about corner kicks. They played anyway. And something about it caught. Football among working women wasn't entirely new. There are scattered references to women's football matches from the late 19th century. But munitions work created the conditions for it to become something larger. Thousands of women concentrated in one place, with regular breaks, shared identity, and an audience of each other. The lunch break kickabout became a ritual, then a competition, then, at some factories, an event. What the football gave them was specific, and it mattered. For 12 hours a day, every movement on the factory floor was controlled. Stand here, fill this casing, tap this detonator, don't move too fast, don't move too slow, don't let the rhythm falter. The body was an instrument of precision, disciplined to a single task, constrained by the demands of explosive chemistry. On the pitch, for 30 minutes, the body was free. Running felt different from standing still. Kicking felt different from tapping. The muscles that had been locked into filling station positions for hours could stretch, extend, fire in directions they'd been denied all morning. The cold air hit the lungs instead of the chemical warmth of the filling room. The women shouted, actually shouted, at full volume after hours of silence enforced by industrial noise. The release was physical, vocal, and total. It was also, in a way that nobody at the time would have called political, an act of claim. Women were not supposed to play football. The social conventions of Edwardian and wartime Britain were clear on this point. Football was a men's game. Women were spectators, supporters, sandwich makers. The idea of a woman kicking a ball in public, running, tackling, sweating, competing, violated every expectation of feminine behaviour that these women had been raised with. They did it anyway. And the crowds came. The story of the Dick Kerr ladies is the story that has survived the longest, and it's worth telling carefully. Dick Kerr and Company was an engineering firm in Preston, Lancashire. Before the war, it made electrical equipment. During the war, it made munitions. The factory employed hundreds of women on the production floor. Like every other munitions factory, it had a yard. Like every other yard, it had a lunch break. And like dozens of other factories, the women at Dick Kerr started playing football. What made Dick Kerr different was a man named Alfred Frankland. Frankland was an office manager at the factory, not a worker on the filling floor, not a foreman, not a director. He was, by his job title, nobody particularly important. But he was the person who noticed the women playing during their lunch break in 1917, and he was the person who had the idea to organise it. Frankland's idea was simple: take the women's lunch break game, give it structure, and play it for charity. The Western Front was producing casualties at a rate that overwhelmed the military hospital system. Charity matches were already common in men's football. Why not women's? He arranged a match. Dick Kerr Ladies versus a team from a neighbouring factory. The venue he secured was Deepdale, the home ground of Preston North End Football Club, a professional men's team with a stadium that could hold tens of thousands. The date he chose was Christmas Day 1917. On the 25th of December 1917, in the third year of the worst war the world had ever seen, 10,000 people showed up at Deepdale to watch women from a munitions factory play football. 10,000. On Christmas Day, in the middle of a war, the turkey could wait. The crowd was not a curiosity audience. It was a football crowd. They paid admission. They cheered. They picked sides. They argued about formations. Fathers brought daughters. Soldiers home on leave came with their wives. The atmosphere was something no one had quite prepared for. A genuine, full-throated, competitive football crowd watching women play. The women played in borrowed kit, adapted from whatever clothing the factory could provide, not the tailored strips that men's teams wore. The shorts were loose, the blouses billowed. Their boots were wrong. Factory boots, or borrowed men's boots a size too large, laced tight to keep them on. Their training regime would not have impressed a modern football academy. 30-minute kickabouts in a factory yard during a lunch break, in between 12-hour shifts handling explosives, and they played well. The passes connected, the tackles were committed, the running was fast and sustained. Faster, some observers noted, than they expected from women who'd been standing at filling benches all week. The crowd responded because the football was real. It wasn't a novelty act. It wasn't a circus performance. It was competitive, physical, skilled football, played by women who happened to spend their working lives in one of the most dangerous environments in wartime Britain. The money raised went to a local military hospital for wounded soldiers. The women who had filled shells all week, who handled explosives that stained their skin and damaged their livers, spent their day off raising money for the men those shells were sent to. The circle of the war economy. Women fill shells. Shells go to men. Men come back broken. Women raise money to mend them. Closed in that match, on that afternoon, in front of 10,000 strangers. The reactions from the men in the crowd were varied and documented. Some were enthusiastic, genuinely impressed by the quality of the football, proud in some cases of wives or daughters who were playing. Some were uncomfortable. The sight of women running, competing, sweating publicly. It disrupted a social order that the war had already damaged but not yet dismantled. A woman filling shells in a factory was doing necessary wartime work. A woman playing football in front of thousands was doing something that felt permanent, and the permanence of it was what made some people nervous. It didn't stop there. The Dick Kerr Ladies kept playing. Other factories formed teams. By 1917, women's football had become a popular spectator sport across industrial Britain. In the northeast of England, the Munitionettes Cup was first contested in 1918. Factory teams competing against each other in formal, organised competition with fixtures, schedules and home and away matches. The tournament drew teams from across the region: Blyth Spartans ladies, Palmer's Shipyard ladies, Armstrong Whitworth ladies. Each team wore its own kit, carried its own identity, and played with a ferocity that reflected the conditions they'd come from. The matches were physical. The pitches were often poor, bumpy, muddy, badly drained. The women played in conditions that would have tested professional men's teams. Twisted ankles were common. Bruised shins were expected. The women played through injuries that would have sidelined more cautious athletes, because the alternative, sitting out a match, missing the 1 hour of the week when the body was free, was not an option they were willing to accept. The crowds were substantial. Some charity matches drew tens of thousands. The money raised went to war charities, hospital funds, and prisoner of war support. The combination of competitive sport and charitable purpose gave the matches a moral authority that made them difficult to criticize. Who could object to women playing football for wounded soldiers? What the women wore on the pitch was different from what they wore in the factory, but not by much. Kit was improvised. Shorts or shortened skirts, loose blouses, football boots if they could get them. Hair was tied back or tucked under a cap. There were no changing rooms designed for women at men's football grounds. They changed where they could. The physical pleasure of playing, of running, of competing, of using the body for something joyful instead of something dangerous, was visible in the way they moved. Accounts from the time describe women playing with an energy that surprised observers, not because women couldn't play, because these particular women had spent their entire week doing the opposite of play. The contrast was electric. There's a promised thread here, and it belongs later in the story. What happened to the football when the war ended? The answer involves the Football Association, a ban, and a phrase that deserves to be quoted exactly when the time comes. I promised we'd come back to it. We will. What matters now, in 1917 and 1918, while the war was still burning and the factories were still running, is what the football meant to the women who played it. It meant public presence, women on a professional pitch, in front of thousands of spectators, performing something physical and competitive and visible. It meant ownership of their bodies, the specific contrast with the factory floor, where every movement was controlled by the demands of explosive chemistry. On the pitch, the body was theirs. The physical joy of it was not incidental. It was central. These were women whose daily physical experience was constrained, repetitive, and dangerous. Running felt different. Kicking felt different. The specific pleasure of a well-struck ball, the contact, the arc, the result, was a pleasure that had no equivalent on the factory floor. The women who scored goals celebrated the way athletes celebrate. Arms raised, voices lifted, teammates rushing in. The crowd responded to that celebration because it was genuine, it was unperformed. It was the natural expression of a body that had been given permission for 30 minutes to do something that felt good. For women who had never competed publicly, women who'd been raised in a culture that discouraged female physical competition of any kind, the experience of standing on a pitch in front of a crowd was transformative in ways that are difficult to overstate. Some of them had never run in public before. Some had never shouted in public before. The football pitch gave them permission to be loud, fast, physical, and competitive, qualities that the culture of the time categorized as exclusively male. The women took those qualities and made them their own, and it meant something else: community. A team was the first thing that had ever been theirs, not their employers, not their husbands, not their families. A team they'd formed themselves, played for themselves, won or lost by their own effort. In a war that reduced most women to supporting roles, knitting, nursing, waiting, enduring, the football team was active, competitive, and entirely self-determined. By 1918, the factories were producing millions of shells per week. Each one was filled by hand one at a time by a woman standing at a bench. The scale of the operation was industrial. The method was human. And somewhere in between the industrial scale and the human method, in the 30-minute gap between the morning shift and the afternoon shift, in a muddy factory yard in Preston, the women who filled the shells had found something that belonged to them, that something would be taken away, but not yet. First, there was Chilwell. The National Shell Filling Factory No. 6 sat outside Nottingham, in the village of Chilwell, Nottinghamshire. It was the largest facility of its kind in Britain. By 1918, the factory was filling millions of shells per week, an output that made it one of the single most important sites in the entire British war effort. The shells filled at Chilwell were shipped to the Western Front, to the artillery batteries that fired them into the German lines. Every shell that exploded in France had, at some point, passed through the hands of a woman at a bench in a building in the English Midlands. The workers were mostly women, most were local, drawn from Nottingham and the surrounding villages. By the time of the explosion, many of them had been at the factory for 2 or 3 years. They were not new. They knew the work, they knew the risks, they knew the colour their hands had turned. They came from the same streets, attended the same churches, shopped at the same markets. Their children played together. Their shifts overlapped. The community inside the factory mirrored the community outside it. On the 1st of July 1918, at 7 minutes past 7 in the evening, something inside the factory detonated. The precise cause has never been conclusively established. The most widely accepted explanation involves metallic contamination in the TNT, a fragment of metal or foreign material that acted as a catalyst, providing the shock that the chemical needed to turn from stable solid to catastrophic explosion. It may have been a tool fragment. It may have been a piece of the bench itself. The inquiry that followed identified possibilities but no certainties. What followed the detonation was not a possibility. It was a fact. 134 people died. That number makes it the single largest loss of life from an accidental explosion in Britain during the entire First World War. Not on the Western Front, not in a German bombing raid, in a factory, in Nottinghamshire, on a summer evening when the light was still in the sky. 250 more were wounded. The blast destroyed the filling hall. It shattered buildings across the factory complex. The sound was heard for miles. The vibration was felt in Nottingham itself, where people stopped in the streets and looked toward the horizon, where a column of smoke was rising from the direction of Chilwell. The Imperial War Museum preserves archive footage filmed at Chilwell, a short film titled A Day in the Life of a Munitions Worker, shot in 1917, a year before the explosion. The footage shows women at their benches filling shells, moving through the changing rooms, walking to work along the same roads they'd walk on the 1st of July, 1918. The women in the footage are calm, methodical, engaged. They do not know what is coming. The film preserves them in the months before their factory became a graveyard. Watching it now, with the knowledge of what happened next, changes what the footage means. Every bench, every woman, every measured action becomes evidence of the routine that the explosion would obliterate. The explosion itself was over in seconds, but the aftermath unfolded over hours. The filling hall was gone. The roof, the walls, the benches, the equipment. In its place was a crater and wreckage. Workers from adjacent buildings rushed toward the site and then in many cases stopped. The heat was too intense. The debris was too dangerous. Small secondary explosions rippled through the wreckage as stored chemicals ignited. The rescue effort was hampered by the very thing the factory had been built to contain. The explosive material was still present in the ruins, and every piece of wreckage was potentially lethal. Among the survivors was a woman named Lottie Martin. Lottie worked at the factory. She was on the site when the explosion occurred. What she saw and how she described it has been preserved in the historical record, and her words carry a weight that no summary can match. She described the aftermath, people emerging from the wreckage, or trying to. Men, women, and young people. Burned, their clothing practically destroyed, torn and dishevelled, their faces black and charred. The description is not literary. It's flat. It has the quality of someone reporting what they saw because they were asked to, not because they chose to. The language doesn't reach for emotion. The facts provide it. Lottie Martin survived. She went home. She came back to work. The specific details of what she felt that night, beyond the words she left behind, are not part of the record. What is part of the record is that she returned. Like so many of the others, she came back through the gate, put on the uniform and went to work in a building that had just killed 134 of her colleagues. Of those 134, 34 could not be identified. The force of the explosion was such that the physical remains of 34 human beings were beyond recognition. No name could be attached to them. No family could claim them. A mass grave was dug, and the 34 were buried together. Of the bodies in that grave, only one could eventually be named. The names that were recovered, the names of those whose remains could be identified, appear on the Nottinghamshire Roll of Honour. Elizabeth Clara Brown, Frances Mary Clark, known as Fanny, Hannah Freer, Mary Crossland, Mary Elizabeth Elliot, known as Polly. These were working women. They had addresses, families, neighbours who missed them. They'd gone to work that morning expecting to come home that evening. The fact that they didn't, the fact that their evening was instead an explosion they never heard coming, is the kind of fact that doesn't soften with distance. I think their names are worth saying aloud, not because the names change the history, but because the alternative, a number, 134, clean and abstract, allows a kind of forgetting that these women don't deserve. The number tells the scale, the names tell the cost. That distinction matters. The government's response to Chilwell followed the pattern established at Silvertown. The factory was classified. The explosion was not widely reported in detail. Production, not at Chilwell, which was too damaged to continue immediately, but at every other filling factory in the country, continued without interruption. The war was 4 months from ending. The demand had not slowed. The production quotas had not changed. The factory at Chilwell was repaired, not replaced, repaired. The damaged sections were cleared, rebuilt, and the filling lines resumed. Women who had survived the explosion, women who had walked through the wreckage and seen what Lottie Martin had seen, returned to their stations. Some returned within days. The documented record shows no formal counselling, no organised support, no acknowledged period of mourning within the factory's operations. The work resumed because the work was needed. There was no national memorial service. No newspaper published a full list of the dead. The language used in official communications described the event as an industrial accident, the same language that had been used for Silvertown. The families of the dead received some form of compensation, but the framework was industrial, not military. The women who died at Chilwell were not classified as war dead. They were classified as workplace casualties. The difference between those two categories was not academic. War dead received pensions for their families, official recognition, national memorial inclusion, and the social status of sacrifice. Workplace casualties received whatever the factory's insurance provided. The distinction meant that the families of Chilwell's dead were treated differently, financially and socially, from the families of soldiers who died on the same day, in the same war for the same cause. That distinction was not corrected during the war. It was not corrected after the war. It persisted quietly and firmly for decades. The response at other factories followed the same pattern as after Silvertown. The women heard the news, in the changing room, on the walk home, through the whisper network that connected every filling hall in the country. And the next morning they dressed in the dark, laced their boots, and walked toward the orange glow at the end of the road. The hairpins went into the tray. The uniform went on. The bench was waiting. The families of the Chilwell dead experienced a grief compounded by secrecy. Because the factory was classified, because the details of the explosion were suppressed, many families received only the most basic information about how their daughter, sister, or mother had died. Some received a formal letter. Some received a visit from a factory official. The language was careful and minimal. There was an explosion. She was killed. We are sorry. The funerals were local. There was no state funeral, no national cortege, no guard of honour. The women who had died filling shells for the British Army were buried by their families in their local churchyards, with the language of civilian death on their headstones. The contrast with military funerals, the flags, the bugles, the formal recognition of sacrifice, was impossible to miss. Neighbours who attended both types of funeral noticed the difference. One kind of death was national, the other was local. The shells were the same shells. For the families who could not identify their dead, the 34 whose remains were beyond recognition, the grief had no clear anchor. No body to bury, no grave to visit. The mass grave provided a location, but not a name. And for the families of the 33 whose names could not even be attached to the bodies in that grave, the loss existed in a permanent state of incompleteness. They knew she was dead. They knew she was in the ground somewhere among the 34. They did not know precisely where. That uncertainty never resolved. The children of the Chilwell dead grew up in a community that remembered, even when the nation did not. The village of Chilwell itself carried the memory of the explosion through generations. The stories were passed down, not in books, not in official histories, but in kitchens and front rooms, told by grandmothers who had been there, who had heard the blast, who had walked past the factory the next morning and seen the gap where the filling hall used to stand. The school that served the area lost pupils. The church that served the area held funerals one after another through the weeks that followed. The local shops lost customers. The pubs lost regulars. The absence was everywhere, in the empty chair at the kitchen table, in the coat still hanging by the door, in the pair of factory boots that nobody moved from the hallway. The community grieved collectively, but the grief was also intensely private. Each family mourned its own specific loss. A daughter who'd been saving for a bicycle, a mother who'd been planning a birthday, a sister who'd been talking about what she'd do when the war was over. The football matches continued. In August 1918, a month after Chilwell, factory teams were still playing, still raising money for war charities, still drawing crowds. The women who had watched a factory explode were, on their day off, playing football in front of thousands of spectators and raising money for wounded soldiers. The fact that they could do both, grieve the dead and play football, fill shells and raise money, carry the yellow on their skin and laugh in the changing room, is not a contradiction. It is the specific emotional texture of lives lived inside impossible conditions. The joy was not despite the loss. It was alongside it. The war had 4 more months to run. The shells still needed filling. The women were still filling them. And on the 11th of November, 1918, it stopped. But the stopping was not what anyone expected. The stopping was not a celebration followed by a thank you. The stopping was something else entirely. A disappearance, managed by legislation, enforced by economics, and sealed by a silence that would last the better part of a century. The armistice came, and then everything the women had built was handed back. The 11th of November, 1918, 11 o'clock in the morning. The guns on the Western Front fell silent. In London, in Manchester, in Birmingham, in Preston, in every factory town in Britain, the news spread in minutes. Church bells rang. People poured into the streets. Women left their factory benches mid-shift. Some accounts describe them walking out of the building without waiting for permission, without changing out of their uniforms, without collecting their hairpins from the tray. The war was over. The shells were no longer needed. The relief was real. It was physical. A loosening in the chest, a lightness in the body, a sound in the streets that is not industrial noise but something closer to joy. Women who had spent 3 years standing at filling benches, in rooms where a spark could end everything, were suddenly standing in daylight, on ordinary streets, with ordinary air in their lungs. Some of them wept, some of them laughed, some of them did both. But the relief carried a question inside it, and the question was immediate. What happens now? The answer came quickly, and it came in the form of legislation. The Restoration of Pre-War Practices Act was passed in 1919. Its purpose was stated plainly in the title, to restore pre-war practices. What that meant in practical terms was this: the jobs that women had filled during the war, in factories, in transport, in engineering and munitions, were to be returned to the men who had held them before 1914. The men were coming home from France. They needed their old positions. The women who'd been doing those positions for 3 years were, under the law, expected to step aside. The speed of the dismantling was remarkable. What had taken 3 years to build, the recruitment, the training, the factory communities, the wages, the independence, the identity, was undone in months. Women who had been earning 2 or 3 times a domestic servant's salary were told their positions were no longer available. The factory gates that had opened in 1915 were, by 1919, closing again, and the women who walked away from them were walking back to the lives they'd left behind. The timing of the demobilisation coincided with one of the most significant political changes in British history. The Representation of the People Act had been passed in 1918, granting the vote to women over 30 who met certain property qualifications. It was a partial victory. Younger women, working-class women, the very women who'd been filling shells, were largely excluded from this first round of enfranchisement. But the Act's passage was directly connected to the war work that women had done. The argument that women were not suited for political participation had been weakened, not destroyed, but weakened, by 3 years of women handling explosives, running factories, and keeping the war economy alive. The paradox was acute. The country was simultaneously acknowledging that women had earned political rights through their war contribution, and removing the economic foundation that had given those rights meaning. A woman could now, in theory, vote, but she could no longer earn the wage that had made her independent. The franchise without the factory was a different kind of freedom than the factory without the franchise had been. Both were incomplete. For many, that meant domestic service. The same work they'd done before the war. The same invisible labour, cleaning, cooking, serving, being quiet, being useful, being unnamed. The pay was what it had always been. A fraction of what the factory had provided. The independence that the factory wage had purchased, the room of their own, the cinema ticket, the lipstick, evaporated with the pay packet. The economic freedom that had made them visible was withdrawn, and with it, much of the visibility itself. The transition was not smooth. Women who had spent 3 years making decisions, earning money, living independently, women who'd walked into rooms full of explosives every morning and managed the fear and the fatigue and the physical danger, were now being told to go back to polishing silver and carrying trays. The mismatch between what these women had been doing and what they were being asked to return to was by any measure enormous. Some women refused. They sought factory work elsewhere or took positions in shops or offices, but the options narrowed quickly. The men were home. The jobs were spoken for. The legislation was clear. The physical sensation of returning to domestic service was its own kind of shock. The factory uniform came off for the last time. The domestic servant's apron went on. The apron was lighter than the factory uniform. Thinner fabric, different smell, no chemical residue. But it felt heavier. The kitchen was quiet. The clock ticked. The floor was wooden, not concrete. The air was warm from the stove, not from chemical reaction. The hands that had filled shells and tapped detonators were now holding a polishing cloth, rubbing silver that belonged to someone else, in a house that belonged to someone else, in a silence so complete that the woman could hear her own breathing. The social adjustment was equally difficult. Women who had been part of a community, the factory community, the football team, the changing room friendships that had carried them through the worst shifts, were suddenly isolated again. Domestic service was solitary work. One cook in one kitchen, one maid in one house. The noise of the factory floor, which had been overwhelming, was replaced by a silence that was its own kind of loss. The women missed each other. That detail appears in oral histories more often than might be expected. Not the money, not the work itself, the company, the specific physical company of other women who understood what the yellow on the hands meant. Some women married returning soldiers. Some of those marriages were happy. Some were complicated by the fact that both parties had spent 3 years doing things the other couldn't fully understand. A soldier who had been in the trenches and a woman who'd been in a munitions factory had both seen things that civilian language couldn't easily hold. In some cases, that shared experience of danger created a bond. In others, it created a silence. The women who had handled TNT carried something else out of the factory gates. They carried the chemical inside their bodies. The health consequences of munitions work didn't stop when the work stopped. Women who'd been exposed to TNT for 2 or 3 years had already absorbed enough of the substance to cause lasting damage. Their livers were compromised. Their immune systems were weakened. The yellow on their skin faded eventually once the exposure ended. But the damage underneath did not fade. It accumulated. And in the months and years after the war, some of these women began to die. Their deaths were recorded as liver failure, or kidney disease, or general debility, not as war-related casualties, not as occupational injuries linked to government-contracted munitions production. The connection between the TNT they'd handled and the organ failure that killed them was known. The 1917 report had documented it in detail, but the connection was not officially acknowledged in their death records. The women who died of toxic jaundice after the war died, on paper, of natural causes. The government's position was consistent with its wartime position. The factories had been necessary. The work had been essential. The risks had been, to use the language of the time, regrettable but unavoidable. Compensation for industrial illness existed in theory. In practice, it was difficult to obtain, slow to process, and modest when it arrived. The women who needed it most, women already weakened by years of chemical exposure, women who could no longer work, women whose husbands had not come back from France, were the women least equipped to fight for it. The process of claiming compensation required documentation that many women did not have. Medical records from the factories were inconsistent. Some factories had kept detailed health records, others had not. The welfare supervisor's notes, where they existed, were filed with the factory administration, not with the workers themselves. A woman seeking compensation for TNT-related illness needed to prove that her symptoms were caused by her wartime work, a burden of proof that fell on the claimant, not on the employer. The doctors who examined these women after the war often had no experience with TNT poisoning. They recognized liver damage, they recognized kidney failure, but the connection between those conditions and the specific chemical exposure that had caused them was not always made. Some doctors attributed the symptoms to other causes: poor diet, constitutional weakness, the general toll of wartime hardship. The women who knew exactly what had caused their illness, who could feel the connection in their bodies, who could trace the timeline from healthy to yellow to ill, were sometimes unable to convince the medical establishment that they were right. The women who died of their wartime chemical exposure died quietly, in terraced houses, in hospital wards, in the years and decades after the war that the country was trying to forget. Their names did not appear on memorials. Their deaths did not appear in the casualty statistics that historians use to calculate the cost of the war. They were the war's invisible dead, killed not by enemy fire but by the chemicals they'd handled in service of their own country's war effort. The football survived longer than most things. The Dick Kerr ladies continued playing after the war ended. The munitions factory was no longer making munitions, but the team kept going. The women who had formed it during their lunch breaks, women who had filled shells and tapped detonators and watched their skin turn yellow, continued to play, and the crowds continued to come. In fact, the crowds grew. In the years immediately after the war, Dick Kerr ladies played to audiences that would have been extraordinary for any football team, men's or women's. On Boxing Day 1920, a match at Goodison Park in Liverpool drew 53,000 spectators. 53,000. It remains one of the largest crowds in the history of women's football anywhere in the world. Another 14,000 were turned away at the gates, unable to get in. The police had to manage crowds that spilled into the surrounding streets. The Goodison Park match was against St Helens Ladies. The Dick Kerr team won 4-0. The money raised, over £3,000, went to the ex-servicemen's distress fund. The women who had filled shells for the army were now, after the war, raising money for the soldiers the army had discharged without adequate support. The government had apparently assumed someone else would handle that part. The players were recognisable figures in their communities. They were stopped in the street, congratulated, discussed in pubs and workplaces. Some had become, by the standards of the time, famous. Not famous in the way that politicians or soldiers were famous. Famous in the way that local sporting heroes are famous, known by name, watched with pride, argued about with passion. For women who had spent the pre-war years in domestic service, invisible and unnamed, the experience of public recognition was transformative. The women's game was, by any measurable standard, a success. It attracted massive audiences. It raised enormous sums for charity. It produced skilled, competitive, popular teams. And it was, from the perspective of the Football Association, a problem. The FA's concerns were not primarily about the quality of the football. They were not about safety. They were not about the physical well-being of the women playing. The FA's stated concern was that football was, and this was the specific phrasing, quite unsuitable for females and ought not to be encouraged. Behind that phrasing lay a specific anxiety, the anxiety of an institution watching something it could not control become more popular than it was comfortable with. In December 1921, the Football Association issued its resolution. It banned women from playing on any pitch affiliated with the FA. Since virtually every proper football ground in England was FA affiliated, the ban effectively ended organised women's football overnight. The teams that had been drawing crowds of tens of thousands were, by the stroke of a committee decision, denied access to any venue large enough to hold those crowds. The FA also stated its belief that the financial donations from women's charity matches were not being properly managed. This claim was never substantiated. The women's teams had meticulous financial records. The charity money had gone exactly where it was supposed to go. The financial objection appeared to be, in the assessment of most historians who have examined the evidence, a pretext. It is time to come back to the promise made earlier, about the phrase that deserved to be quoted exactly. Here it is. Quite unsuitable for females. That was the FA's official language. Not dangerous, not impractical, unsuitable. A word that carries judgment in its marrow. A word that says more about who was making the decision than about who was being decided about. The ban held for nearly 50 years. It was not formally lifted until 1971. The women who had started playing in factory yards in 1916, women who had filled shells, handled explosives, survived factory explosions, raised hundreds of pounds for war charities, and drawn crowds of 50,000, were told, 3 years after the war ended, that the game they'd built wasn't suitable for them. The Dick Kerr ladies continued to play. They played on non-FA grounds. They played on recreation pitches, on farmers' fields, on any surface that wasn't officially affiliated. They travelled abroad, playing matches in France in 1920, drawing large crowds there as well. They adapted to every obstacle the ban created. They played for another 44 years, folding only in 1965. Alfred Frankland, the office manager who'd first organised the Christmas Day match, remained involved until his death. His loyalty to the team he'd created was as durable as the team itself. The memorials that went up across Britain in the years after the war bore the names of men, carved into stone, painted onto wood, etched into brass. The village memorials, the church plaques, the cenotaphs in city centres. These were the country's formal recognition of sacrifice. The language was specific. They gave their lives, they served, they fell. The names were soldiers' names. Munitions workers were not on those memorials. Their names were not carved into stone. Their deaths were not described as service. The women who had died at Silvertown, at Chilwell, of toxic jaundice in the years that followed, their sacrifice was filed under a different heading: industrial accident, workplace casualty, natural causes. The categories were bureaucratic, and they were permanent. The contrast between the memorial language and the industrial language is the gap where the real story lives. A soldier who died on the Western Front died in service of his country. A woman who died at Chilwell, filling shells for the same army, died in an industrial accident at her place of work. The shells she filled may have saved the soldier standing next to the memorial that bore his name. Her name was not on it. In the churchyard at Attenborough, near Chilwell, there are headstones for some of the women who died in the explosion. The stone is local, grey, weathered by a century of English rain. The inscriptions are brief, a name, a date, a line about accident or duty. The grass around them is kept short. The flowers, when there are flowers, are placed by descendants who heard the story from their grandmothers. The headstones sit among the village dead, not in a military section, not in a row of identical government-issued markers, among the ordinary dead, in ordinary ground, as though what happened to them had been ordinary. That absence was not corrected for a very long time. The recognition, when it finally began to arrive, came not from the government or the military establishment, but from the communities themselves. Local historians in Silvertown and Chilwell began researching the explosions. Families pieced together their grandmothers' stories. Archives were searched, names were recovered, and eventually, decades after the fact, a century in some cases, memorials were built. The yellow poppy emerged as a symbol, not a replacement for the red poppy, which commemorated the battlefield dead, a companion to it. The consistent thread across many of these accounts is not bitterness, it is pride. A quiet, specific, unshakable pride in having done work that mattered, under conditions that could have killed them, for a country that largely forgot they'd done it. Several of the women recorded by the IWM use a phrase, or something close to it, that recurs. We knew it mattered. We knew the soldiers needed the shells. We knew what would happen if we stopped, so we didn't stop. The simplicity of that logic is its own kind of monument. Some of the women who gave testimony still had traces of the yellow. Decades after the exposure ended, some reported that the discoloration had never fully faded from the deepest creases of their hands. Whether this was physical, TNT residue permanently embedded in the skin, or a trick of aging, no one tested. But the women believed it. They held out their hands to the camera and pointed. See? Still there. After all this time, the factories are gone. The buildings were demolished, repurposed, replaced by housing estates and supermarkets. The streets where women walked before dawn, boots on cobblestone, are still there, but the orange glow at the end of the road is not. The factory gate that swung open at 5 in the morning is a memory held now only by documents and descendants. What remains is a colour, yellow, on the hands, on the face, on the pages of the record, yellow as evidence, yellow as cost, yellow as the mark of presence, the proof that a woman was there, that she stood at the bench, that she filled the shell, that she handled the thing that turned her body into a map of what she'd done. The yellow was the last thing anyone noticed, but it was the first thing the women carried home. Home, though, is where this story needs to go one more time, not to the after, but to the during, to the body itself, to the specific, physical, hour-by-hour experience of a day in a munitions factory, reconstructed not as a timeline but as a sensation, because the body is where this story actually lives, not in the legislation, not in the memorials, not in the statistics of production or the arithmetic of compensation, in the hands, in the shoulders, in the feet, in the skin that changed colour while the woman wearing it kept working. Start before dawn, 4:30 in the morning, a bedroom in a terraced house in a factory town, Lancashire or Yorkshire or Nottinghamshire, in the winter of 1917. The room was not heated. The fire downstairs had gone out hours ago, and the cold had settled into the walls, the floor, the blankets themselves. Getting out of bed at 4:30, in a room where the temperature had dropped to something close to freezing, required a decision that the body resisted every morning. The warmth of the bed was the last gentle thing the day would offer. Feet on the floor, cold through the soles, the first sensation of the day, before the kettle, before the bread, before the walk, was cold stone or cold wood against bare skin. The body woke up through its feet. The dressing was quick. Layers, not for fashion, but for insulation. Heavy wool, rough against the skin, warm enough to hold body heat for the 30-minute walk. The coat went on last. The boots, the same boots, the cracked leather, the wearing soles, laced tight. And then the door. Outside, the dark was total. The streets were empty, or nearly so. Just the other women, emerging from their own doors, falling into step, boots hitting the cobblestones. That sound again. The rolling percussion of factory boots on stone in the dark before dawn. It was the sound of the body in motion before the body was ready for motion. Cold air in the lungs, cold stone under the feet, the orange glow of the factory ahead. The walk took 20 minutes, or 30, depending on the distance. The body warmed as it moved. The cold air sharpened the mind. The breath made small clouds. The conversation, if there was any, was quiet. Morning voices, not yet fully awake, exchanging small words about the shift ahead, about the weather, about nothing in particular. The important thing was the walking, the rhythm of it, the way the group moved together without needing to coordinate. Some of the women had children. They'd left sleeping children in beds that were still warm. Some had left a husband's breakfast on the table covered with a cloth. Some lived alone, the man at the front, or the man gone entirely. The house they'd left behind would be cold when they returned. The fire would need lighting again. But that was 12 hours away. Right now, the only direction was forward, toward the gate, toward the glow. At the gate, the ritual began. The coat came off. The civilian clothes came off. The jewellery, what little there was, came off. And the hairpins. One by one, pulled from the hair, placed in the numbered tray. The specific sensation of a hairpin leaving the hair it has held in place all night. The slight pull, the looseness that follows, the feeling of something structured becoming unstructured. The hair falling loose, the factory cap going on, the uniform next. The chemical smell hit immediately, not fresh, not sharp, but settled. The fabric had absorbed so much TNT residue over weeks of washing and wearing that the smell had become part of its texture. Pulling the uniform over the skin was like stepping into the factory before the body had even reached the floor. The smell announced where the day was going. The inspection. Standing still while another woman checked the hands, the hair, the seams of the uniform. The brief, impersonal contact. One woman's hands checking another woman's body for metal, for contraband, for anything that might kill them both. It lasted less than a minute. It happened every single day. Then the door opened and the floor was there. The first hour was adjustment, the heat arriving, the noise pressing in, the body finding its station, picking up the tool, beginning the sequence. Scoop, pour, tamp, weigh, pass, reach, begin again. The hands knew the work. The muscles remembered the motions. The first 100 shells went quickly, almost automatically, while the mind was still arriving. The second and third hours were when the body settled into the work. The initial adjustment faded. The heat became background. The noise became texture. The hands found their pace, not rushed, not slow, but the specific sustainable rhythm that 12 hours demanded. The women who'd been doing this for months had calibrated that rhythm precisely. Too fast, and the muscles would burn out before noon. Too slow, and the supervisor would notice. The pace was a negotiation between the body's limits and the factory's demands, conducted silently, automatically, shift after shift. By the fourth hour, the rhythm had set in completely. The body was no longer thinking about the motions. It had entered the specific mental state that repetitive physical work produces, not boredom, but a kind of absorption, a narrowing of attention to the immediate physical space, the bench, the casing, the powder, the tap, the world outside the factory, the streets, the house, the war, the newspapers, receded. What remained was the work itself, and the body doing it. The eyes adjusted too. The flat factory light, which had seemed harsh in the first hour, became normal. The yellow of the TNT powder, which was vivid and alarming to new workers, became simply the colour of the job. The women's vision narrowed to the immediate workspace, the casing in front of them, the powder measure, the tapping tool, the balance. Everything else was peripheral. The world shrank to the size of a workbench. The fatigue arrived in stages. First the feet, a dull, persistent ache from standing on concrete. The women shifted their weight from one foot to the other, a constant, unconscious adjustment that everyone on the floor did. Then the lower back, tightening under the weight of the same posture held for hours. The spine, which had been upright since 5 a.m, began to protest. Then the small muscles of the hands and forearms, the ones that controlled the tapping tool, the ones that determined whether the detonator seated correctly or fired, those muscles burned. A quiet, steady burn that didn't fade with rest, because there was no rest. Not for the hands, not during the shift. The lunch break was 30 minutes of relief so intense it bordered on pain. Sitting down, actually sitting, after 4 or 5 hours of standing was a sensation that began in the legs and moved upward through the entire body. The muscles, which had been held rigid, loosened all at once. The feet throbbed, the back unlocked. The hands, freed from the tapping tool, opened and closed slowly, working out the stiffness. Some women flexed their fingers in patterns, an unconscious exercise repeated during every break that kept the joints from seizing. The food was what there was. Bread, if the rationing allowed it. Margarine, scraped thin. A piece of cheese growing smaller each day as the week progressed. Cold tea from a flask, or hot tea from the canteen urn if the factory had one. The taste of the food was ordinary, but the taste of anything that wasn't TNT dust was, by the 4th hour of a shift, extraordinary. The mouth had been tasting chemicals, now it tasted bread. The contrast was the luxury, and then the bell, or the whistle, or simply the clock. The break was over. The body rose, the walk back to the bench, the tapping tool in the hand again, the sequence resuming. Scoop, pour, tamp, weigh, pass, reach, begin again. The long afternoon, hour 8, hour 9, hour 10. The fatigue was no longer arriving. It had arrived, and it was staying. The legs felt like they were wrapped in something heavy. The lower back had passed through ache into a kind of numbness that wasn't comfortable but was at least predictable. The hands were the problem now. The concentration required for the detonator tap, that absolute precision, that zero margin for error tap every single time, became harder to maintain as the muscles tired. The mind fought to stay present. The body wanted to drift. The dangerous hours were the last 3, not because the TNT changed. It didn't. The TNT was the same at hour 10 as it had been at hour 1. The danger increased because the women changed. Their reflexes slowed. Their grip loosened by fractions of a millimeter. The tap that had been precisely calibrated at 7 in the morning was by 5 in the afternoon being delivered by hands that were fighting to hold their position. The supervisors knew this. The women knew it too. The last hours of a shift were when the extra concentration was needed, and it was exactly then that concentration was hardest to find. Some women develop rituals to stay focused, counting shells in groups of 10, timing their breathing to match the rhythm of the tapping, fixing their eyes on a specific point on the bench, and refusing to look away. Others found that humming helped, a barely audible vibration in the throat, not a tune, just a frequency that kept the mind engaged. The factory floor was too loud for anyone else to hear it. It was private, a survival technique disguised as a habit. By hour 11, the body had entered a state beyond ordinary tiredness. It was the specific exhaustion of sustained physical work combined with sustained mental precision. The muscles had given everything they had. The mind had maintained focus against every instinct telling it to stop. What remained was a kind of emptied-out endurance, the body operating on discipline alone, long past the point where motivation or willpower had anything left to offer. The smell of the room had changed. It wasn't the sharp chemical edge of the morning anymore. It was heavier now, layered. The chemical was still there, but underneath it the room smelled of human effort, sweat, warmth, exhalation, the particular scent of bodies that had been working in close proximity for 10 hours. The air felt thick. The ventilation fans moved it, but not enough. There was a faintly metallic taste at the back of the throat that appeared around hour 8 and stayed until the end. Then, the end. The shift signal. The specific sound that meant the 12 hours were done. The sensation of hearing that sound after a full day of standing, tapping, concentrating, enduring, that sensation started as relief and became something larger. The muscles released, the posture dropped, the breath changed, the hands set down the tool for the last time that day, and the fingers uncurled slowly, stiffly, as though remembering that they could. The walk to the changing room, the uniform coming off, the weight of it lifting from the shoulders, the chemical smell releasing from the fabric as it was peeled away, the civilian clothes going back on, the feeling of familiar cloth against skin that had been wrapped in factory fabric for 12 hours, and the hairpins, the tray with the numbered label, the pins going back in one by one into hair that had been loose under a cap all day, the structure returning, the small private restoration of something that had been surrendered at the gate 12 hours earlier, outside, the factory gate behind, not ahead, the cold air, real air, not factory air, not chemical air, hitting the skin, the specific sensation of wind on a face that had been in a sealed room since before sunrise. The orange glow of the factory, which had seen the landmark on the morning walk, was now behind, receding, growing smaller with each step. The walk home was the same cobblestones, the same boots, the same distance, but everything about the walk was different. The body moved differently, heavier, slower, with a tiredness that lived in the bones rather than the muscles. The rhythm of boots on stone was the same rhythm as the morning, but quieter now, slower, more deliberate. The women didn't sing on the way home. They walked, and they thought about ordinary things, what to eat, when to sleep, whether the morning would come too soon. And it would. It always did. The streets were different in the evening. Other people were in them now. Children playing in the last light, shopkeepers pulling down their shutters, men home from whatever work the war had left them. Dogs trotted across roads that had been empty at 5 a.m. The smell of the street had changed too. Coal smoke from chimneys, cooking from open windows, the damp stone smell that rose from the cobbles as the temperature dropped. The factory women moved through the ordinary world like visitors from somewhere else. Their uniforms were gone, but the yellow on their hands remained visible. People who passed them on the street could tell where they'd been. The yellow was a badge. It was also a warning. It said, "This woman works with explosives." It said, "The thing she handles every day could kill her." It said, "She's still here." The groups thinned as the walk home progressed. Women peeled off at their own streets one by one with a word or a wave. The group that had walked together in the dark that morning, 20 strong, boots on cobblestone, became 10, then 5, then 2, then one woman walking alone down her own street, toward her own door, at the end of a day that had lasted since before dawn. Some women stopped at a shop on the way home. Bread, if there was any. Milk, if the queue wasn't too long. The rationing made every purchase a calculation. What could be afforded? What could be found? What would last until tomorrow? The wages were good, but the war economy had driven prices up, and the choices were narrowing month by month. Home, the door, the chair, the specific relief of weight leaving the feet as the boots came off. The laces loosened, the leather eased away from swollen ankles, the soles peeled from stockings that were damp with the day's walking. The feet, freed from the boots, throbbed with a dull, deep pulse that would last for an hour. The specific relief of sitting, after a day when sitting, had not been permitted for more than 30 minutes. The body settled, the spine decompressed, the shoulders dropped. The meal, if there was one, was small. Soup, if she'd prepared it the night before. Toast, if the bread hadn't run out. Tea, always tea. The warmth of it moving through a body that was running on nothing. The food was fuel, not pleasure. The body needed it, and took it without ceremony. A wash, not a bath. Heating enough water for a bath was a luxury that most working women couldn't afford on a weekday evening. A basin of warm water, a cloth, a scrub of the hands and face. The yellow didn't come off. She knew that by now. The scrubbing was a ritual, not a solution. But the ritual mattered. The soap smelled of something that wasn't TNT. The warm water on the face was a small tenderness in a day that hadn't offered many. The day was over, and somewhere in the room, or in the mirror, or in the way the lamplight caught the hands, the yellow, still there, always there now, the colour of the work carried in the skin, the proof of where the body had been and what it had done. If there were children, they'd be put to bed first. A story, maybe, or just a tucking in. The children knew what the yellow meant. They'd seen it before. Some of them touched their mother's hands and asked why they were that colour. Some of them didn't ask. They just held the yellow hand and went to sleep. The eyes closed, the candle went out, or the lamp was turned down. The dark arrived. The same dark that had been outside the window at 4:30 that morning, when the whole thing began. And inside that dark, the body rested. The hands stopped moving. The mind released the rhythm of the tapping. The feet, which had carried a woman to the factory and back, went still. She would do it again tomorrow. She knew that. The alarm would sound in the dark. The cold floor would be there. The boots would lace up. The walk would begin. The gate would be waiting. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, for now, the body was still. The factories have been gone for a long time now. The buildings were taken down. The benches were dismantled. The filling halls where the yellow powder settled on every surface. They don't exist anymore. The streets are still there, mostly, but the women who walk them before dawn are not. The last of the Canary Girls have passed from living memory into the kind of memory that depends on ink and archive and intention. What they left behind is not a monument. It's not a ceremony. It's not even, in most cases, a name on a wall. What they left behind is a story about women who walked into buildings full of explosives every morning, who watched their own skin change colour, who knew what the chemicals were doing, and who came back anyway. Not because they were fearless, because they had decided that the work was worth the cost, and because nobody else was going to do it. This sleep they found at the end of each day was hard-earned. The kind of sleep that comes after the body has given everything it has. The kind that arrives not as a choice but as a necessity. The mind letting go because it cannot hold on any longer. It is perhaps the most honest kind of rest there is. Tonight, wherever this story has found you, the dark is the same dark. Not the dark of a factory town in 1917, but dark all the same. Quiet, familiar, safe enough to let go. The boots are off. The walk is done. The gate is far behind now. Let the shoulders drop. Let the hands go still. Let the weight of the day, whatever kind of day it was, settle into the mattress and stay there. There is nothing left to carry tonight. The women who filled the shells would understand that feeling, the moment when the body finally stops and the work is done, and the only thing left is rest. They earn that moment every night, for 3 years, in buildings that could have killed them. The rest they found wasn't peace exactly. It was the specific stillness that follows effort. The empty quiet of a body that has been used completely. The factory floor at midnight, one last time. The benches in rows. The yellow powder catching the light. The rhythm of the tapping slowing now as the night shift approaches its end. The women at their stations, hands moving from memory, faces calm, the yellow on their skin glowing faintly in the artificial light. This is the image that stays, not the explosion, not the legislation, not the ban. This, the ordinary shift, the ordinary work, the ordinary woman standing at an ordinary bench doing an extraordinary thing with her ordinary hands. Rest came to them the same way it comes to everyone, slowly, quietly. One breath, and then another. The chest rising and falling, the shoulders letting go, the jaw unclenching, the eyes growing heavy behind closed lids. The dark did what the dark has always done. It held them. It asked nothing of them. It let the day dissolve. Somewhere in the quiet, the last thread of the day released. The bench, the powder, the tap, the gate, the walk, the boots, the cold, the heat, the noise, the yellow. All of it, loosening its grip one strand at a time as the body descended into rest, not fighting the descent now, welcoming it. Leaning into the dark the way a tired body leans into a chair, completely without reservation, because there is nowhere else to go. The factories were necessary, the women were necessary, the shells were necessary. And the rest at the end of it all was necessary too, the most necessary thing of all, perhaps. The body's final, non-negotiable demand, after everything else has been given, after the work is done and the danger survived and the day endured, the demand that remains is simply this: stop, be still, let the dark do what the dark does. The yellow faded from their hands eventually, but not from the record, not from the story. That stays. The colour of the work, the colour of the cost, the colour of the women who stood at the bench and didn't stop. The story of the Canary Girls is not a story about victims. It is a story about women who made a calculation that the work was dangerous, that the chemicals were harmful, that the explosions were possible, and who walked through the factory gate anyway, morning after morning, shift after shift, year after year. Not because they had no choice. They had a choice. They chose the factory, and the factory gave them something in return. Not safety, not health, not lasting recognition, but something else. Purpose, community, wages, identity, a football team, a dance on Saturday night, a name for themselves, Canary Girls, yellow-skinned and unafraid. Standing at the bench in rooms full of explosive, doing the work that the war required and that nobody else was doing, they earned their rest. The factory glow is gone now. The road is quiet. The boots are still. Good night.